My father stood over the burning barrel and said it like he was doing me a favor. Your sister has 2 kids and no husband. You have drawings. Guess which one actually matters. He fed my thesis boards into the fire one by one. 4 years of work, the model I'd built by hand, the sketchbook with my grandmother's notes still inside. Then he looked at me through the smoke and added the part that still sits in my chest. Some women build real lives. Some women just play architect. Be useful for once. I didn't fight him that night. I just watched everything burn. 2 years later, my sister's firm won a $22 million public contract with a design I would recognize in my sleep. My father texted me the same afternoon. See, she actually did something with her life. He still doesn't know where I work now, or that the proposal is already sitting on my desk. My name is Karen. I'm 33 years old. If this already makes your blood boil, like and subscribe. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I read every comment. Drop Team Karen if you're ready, because what happens next will not be quiet. To understand how a woman ends up watching her father burn 4 years of her life, you have to understand the house I grew up in. Not the building, the rules. We lived in a 2-story colonial on the edge of Columbus, Ohio, the kind with a basketball hoop nobody used, and a lawn my father kept like it was a job interview. From the outside we were fine. Better than fine. My father, Gerald, fixed his neighbors' fences for free and shook every hand at church. My mother, Diane, brought casseroles to funerals. People liked us. Inside, there was an arithmetic nobody wrote down, but everybody obeyed. My younger sister, Brooke, was the one with the gift. I was the one with the time. Brooke was 3 years younger than me, and from the day she could talk, she was the artistic one. When she drew a horse, my parents framed it. When I drew a house with a working floor plan at 11, my father asked who was going to pay for the paper. It wasn't cruelty exactly. It was a decision they'd made about who each of us was, and they were loyal to that decision the way some people are loyal to a team that keeps losing. By the time I was finishing my master's in architecture, Brooke had 2 kids, Caleb and Lily, and no husband. The father had left before Lily could walk, and so a new line entered the family scripture. Brooke needs help. I want to be fair about this, because I've had years to think about it. Brooke was overwhelmed. 2 small children alone is hard. If my family had asked me to help, I would have said yes, and meant it. They didn't ask. They assigned. You don't have babies to think about, my mother said one Sunday, handing me a diaper bag as I walked in the door. She said it warmly, like she was giving me a gift. So you have the time. Brooke has the babies. You just have drawings. I remember standing in the kitchen with Lily on my hip, and my sketchbook flipped face down on the counter next to a bottle of formula, and I remember thinking, I have a thesis due in 4 months. But I didn't say it. In that house, my deadlines were hobbies and Brooke's were emergencies. Here's the thing about being the reliable one. Nobody ever thanks you, because reliability isn't a gift in their eyes. It's just weather. It's just what you are. I spent most of my final year of graduate school living in my parents' spare room. Officially, I had an apartment near campus. In reality, I slept there maybe 2 nights a week. The rest of the time I was at my parents' house, because that's where the kids were, and that's where I was needed, and needed was the only currency that bought me any standing at all. My father had a phrase for it. Family first. He said it the way other men say grace. The clearest picture I have of that year isn't the fire. It's a decision that got made about my life without me in the room. It was February, 3 months before my thesis review. I came to Sunday dinner and my mother announced to the table that I'd be staying at the house full-time through the spring to cover the kids because Brooke had picked up weekend shifts and couldn't afford a sitter. It wasn't a request. It was logistics that had already been settled. My name had come up in a conversation I wasn't part of, and I'd been assigned like a shift on a schedule. I have my review in May, I said. It was the closest I ever came, that whole year, to standing up for myself. The whole thing is that spring. It's the biggest thing I've ever done. And you'll have plenty of time for your drawings once the kids are down, my father said, not even unkindly. Multitask. Women do it every day. He said it like he was handing me wisdom. Brooke didn't look up from her plate. She'd learned, the way I never quite did, that the smartest thing to do when the family was spending you was to stay very quiet and let it happen. I want to be honest about the kids, because they're the one part of that house I don't have a complaint about. Caleb was 5 that spring, all questions, and Lily was 2, and slept on my chest when she had a fever. I loved them. I still do. I used to prop my sketchbook on the arm of the couch and draw while Lily napped on me, and Caleb would climb up and ask me what I was making, and I'd say a library, and he'd ask if it would have dinosaurs, and I'd tell him sure, in the kids section, and he'd be satisfied. They weren't the ones taking anything from me. They were just the reason it was so easy for everyone else to. I remember one specific Sunday because it's the one where I finally understood the ledger. We were at dinner. Brooke had dropped out of design school 2 years earlier when Caleb was born, and someone brought it up, an aunt, I think, asking if she'd ever go back. Brooke gave up school for her family, my father said, and he put his hand over hers on the table. That's what real sacrifice looks like. Then he looked at me. Your sister gave up everything. What have you given up? I was 3 months from a master's degree I had paid for myself. I had a competition entry under review. I had a thesis that 2 professors had called the strongest in the studio. And my father was asking me, at his own table, what I had ever sacrificed. I didn't answer. On the mantel behind him, there was a family photo from the year before, one of those professional ones with everyone in white shirts. Brooke was in the center holding both kids. I was at the edge, and the frame had cropped me so that half my shoulder was gone. Nobody had done it on purpose. Nobody needed to. That was just where I fit. They called it sacrifice when she quit. They called it selfishness when I didn't. And because I was at that house almost every night, my work lived there too. My boards, my models, my portfolio. 4 years of it, stacked in labeled boxes in the garage. Because there was no room in the spare bedroom, and because this is the part that still makes me laugh, the bad kind of laugh. I thought it was safe there. It was my parents' house. What could be safer than that? I'd handed my father the keys to the only thing I couldn't rebuild, and I'd done it while thanking him for the storage space. I need you to understand what was in those boxes, because if you don't, the fire is just a fire. It isn't. It was the end of 4 years of the best thing I have ever made. I want to tell you about the library. When I was a girl, the one person in my family who looked at my drawings and saw drawings, not a waste of paper, not a phase, was my grandmother. My mother's mother. Vivian. She was a retired school teacher with paint under her nails and a way of noticing things other people walked past. She used to take me downtown and make me look up at the old buildings, the cornices, the little carved details nobody sees. Notice the small things, little Wren, she'd say. That was her name for me. Little Wren. I was small and quick, and I hid when there were too many people, and she loved that about me when other people were trying to fix it. She gave me a sketchbook when I was 9. A real one, leather, too nice for a child. She'd written notes in the margins over the years, reminders, little drawings of her own, one pressed flower gone flat and brown. It was the most valuable object I owned, and it wasn't worth anything to anyone but me. Vivian died in early 2020. And somewhere in the grief of that year, the idea for my thesis arrived almost whole. A public library, not a monument. A building designed around the people libraries actually serve and everyone else forgets. The kid doing homework because home is loud. The old man who comes in just to be warm. The woman filling out a job application on a public computer. A building for the people no one builds for. Professor Hart ran the studio where the design grew up. She wasn't easy. She'd made 2 students cry the first month, and I respected her more for it. The first time I pinned up the library, half the class thought it was too soft, too sentimental, a building about feelings. Hart stood in front of it for a long time with her arms crossed, and then she turned around and said, to the whole room, "This is the most honest thing on these walls. It's the only project up here that knows who it's for. Don't any of you talk her out of it." She looked at me. "And don't you let them." She sent me an email that night with 3 notes in it, all about making the structure braver, and I did every one. That email, dated, detailed, unmistakably about this exact building, is one of the reasons I'm still standing. I didn't know it then. You never know which of the small things is load-bearing until later. The design had a folded timber roof that opened toward the west, so the reading room filled with low afternoon light, a roof that looked, if you squinted, like a book laid open and turned face down to hold your place. It had a single off-center steel mast carrying a reading room that cantilevered out over the entrance, which is an unusual structural move, the kind a review panel either loves or fails you for. And in the threshold, in the floor of the main entrance, I hid something. I always did. In every project I designed, I set a small brass wren into the floor, no bigger than a thumbnail. For her. No client would ever notice it. That was the point. It was a private signature, a thing that was mine, tucked into a building anyone could walk into. I developed that design for 4 years. It started as a rough undergraduate concept and grew, through 3 years of graduate studio, into a full thesis. Along the way, I did 2 things almost by accident that mattered more than I understood at the time. In 2023, I entered the design in a national student competition, which meant there was a dated, time-stamped submission of my work sitting on somebody else's server, under my name, before any of the rest of this happened. And I backed up my digital files to the cloud, the way everyone does. But the best of it lived only on paper and foam. The final refinements, the ones that made the design sing, I made by hand, directly on the physical boards and in the model, in the last weeks. I told myself I'd digitize them once things calmed down. The cloud version was rougher. The paper version was the real one. 2 of those habits would save me. One gap in them would nearly cost me everything. Because here is what was coming. That spring, my design had made the final round of a graduate fellowship. A big one, the kind with a stipend and a firm placement attached. Win the fellowship, take the job. It was without exaggeration the door to my entire career. The final round was in person. You presented your physical boards and your model to a panel, in a room, at 9 in the morning, on a fixed date. There was no digital option. There was no email us your files. You stood in the room with the thing you'd built, or you didn't stand there at all. The night before, I stayed at my parents' house so I could load the model into my car first thing in the morning. Everything I needed was in that garage. And a few days before that, something happened that I told, for years, as the good part of the story. My father, who had spent my whole life calling my work a hobby, offered to help. A man should help his daughter protect her work, he said. He was in the garage when I came in, and he had this almost tender look on his face. Lay them all out for me, every page. I'll photograph everything so you have a record, in case anything ever happens. I was so moved I nearly cried. In 31 years, I could count on one hand the times my father had shown interest in what I did. So I laid it all out under the garage lights. The boards, propped along the workbench. The model, and he asked me to turn it so he could get every side. And I did, holding it up like a girl showing a science project. And the sketchbook. He asked for that too, specifically, which should have been the thing that stopped me, because he'd never once cared about a private notebook. But I wanted so badly for it to be what it looked like that I turned it page by page for him. My grandmother's handwriting, her little bird, the pressed flower. He photographed all of it, slowly, methodically, the way you'd document something for an insurance claim. He even asked me, at one point, which pages were the important ones. I told him. I pointed at the final refinements, the ones that only existed there, and I said, "These are the parts that make it work." He nodded and took his time on those. I have thought about that nod more than almost anything else in my life. For years I told people that was the night my father finally saw my work. I was right. He saw all of it. The night before my final review, I came back to my parents' house a little after 10. The kitchen was dark. Through the window over the sink I could see an orange light moving in the backyard, and I thought at first that a neighbor was burning leaves. It was my father. He was standing over the rusted burning barrel he kept by the shed, the one he used for yard waste, and he was feeding my boards into it, one at a time, unhurried. I don't remember crossing the yard. I remember the heat and the smell. Not wood smoke, something chemical, the foam of the model curling and blackening. I remember reaching into the barrel and burning the side of my hand and not feeling it until later. The steel mast I'd spent a weekend getting right had already slumped into a black hook. The cover of my grandmother's sketchbook was charring at the edge, the leather bubbling. Dad, Dad, stop! He put a hand on my chest, not hard, just enough to keep me back from the fire. Like I was the danger. It's done, he said. It's better this way. Do you know what tomorrow? I know exactly what tomorrow is. He didn't even look at the barrel. He looked at me, through the smoke, the way you look at a child who's been chasing something ridiculous for too long. Your sister has 2 kids and no husband. You have drawings. Guess which one actually matters. I want to tell you I screamed. I've replayed it 1,000 times and imagined the version where I scream. But I didn't. I stood there with my hand throbbing and my whole life going up in a barrel, and something in me understood that if I screamed, this would become a story about my tantrum. He would tell it that way for years. Karen, so dramatic, over some school project. I refused to hand him that, so I just watched everything burn. He handed me the dish towel that was hanging off his shoulder so I could wipe the soot off my hands. Then he said the sentence I've never been able to put down. Some women build real lives, Karen. Some women just play architect. He said it gently. That's the part people never believe. He wasn't shouting. He believed it, the way you believe the sun comes up. Be useful for once. Your sister needs you home with her kids. My mother came out onto the back step in her robe. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't ask why there was a fire, or why her daughter was standing in the yard at 10 at night with a burned hand and her whole face coming apart. She'd known this was going to happen. I could see it in the way she didn't look surprised, in the way she pulled her robe tighter against the cold and not against the horror of it. It's just paper, Karen, she said. Don't make it a whole thing. Be the bigger person. I went inside. Brooke was on the couch with her feet up, scrolling her phone, the kids asleep upstairs. She looked at my face and my hand and she said, God, what's wrong with you? Not cruel, just annoyed, the way you'd react to someone bringing weather into the living room. I understood then that she didn't know what was in the barrel. Not yet. Whatever she'd become later. That night my sister genuinely had no idea that our father had just handed her the rest of her life, wrapped in ash. I went up to the spare room and I sat on the edge of the bed until it got light, and I did not sleep, and I did not cry, because I was saving both of those for later, and I didn't know yet how much later would be. The next morning, I stood in the fellowship review room at 9 a.m., with an empty easel I'd brought out of pure reflex, because my hands didn't know what else to do. I asked the chair if I could reschedule. I explained that my materials had been destroyed. I didn't say by whom. Even then, some reflex of family loyalty made me swallow that. She was kind about it. That almost made it worse. I'm so sorry, she said. But we evaluate what's in the room. We have 12 candidates in one day. I wish I could do something. The candidate after me was already setting up in the hall, unwrapping bubble wrap from a model, and I remember standing there with my empty easel and watching him do the thing I couldn't do, and feeling something go very quiet and very final inside me. I thought about explaining. I thought about pulling up my cloud files on my phone right there and saying, look, it's real, it existed, I can show you the drawings. But you can't present a career on a phone screen in a hallway. You can't rebuild a model out of a JPEG in the 90 seconds before your slot closes. I'd spent 4 years learning to make something you could stand in front of, and the one morning it mattered, I was standing in front of nothing. I drove home and I didn't tell anyone at the house what had happened, because they already knew, and because the only person who would have understood was a professor I was too ashamed to call. The fellowship went to someone else. The firm placement went with it. And the strangest part, the part that took me 2 years to fully understand, is that I had backups. I had cloud files. I had a competition entry with my name and a date on it. I had proof that the building was mine sitting on servers all over the country, and none of it could put a physical model on an easel at 9 in the morning. None of it could redo, overnight, the refinements that only existed on burned paper. None of it could hand me back my grandmother's sketchbook. I had backups of the building. I had no way to be in 2 years at once. Before I left my parents' backyard that night, I'd done one thing. I'd scooped a handful of ash out of the cold edge of the barrel into an empty jam jar. Not to mourn it, to remember it. My mother watched me do it and shook her head like I was being morbid. They thought they'd burned the building. They'd only burned the paper. But it took me a long time to learn the difference, and the learning nearly finished me. I didn't fall apart loudly. I fell apart the quiet way, which is harder to see and takes longer to fix. The first casualty was my mentor. Professor Eleanor Hart had believed in that thesis more than she believed in most things. She'd written notes in the margins of my drawings. She'd fought for it in faculty meetings. She'd told me not to let anyone talk me out of the honesty of it. And when I missed the fellowship round and then went silent, she didn't know why. I couldn't tell her. I was too ashamed. Not of what my father did, of the whole shape of my life, the fact that a grown woman had let her thesis be stored in a garage and burned by her own dad. I thought if I said it out loud, she'd see me the way my family saw me. Someone whose work could be destroyed because it was never that important to begin with. So I said nothing, and I let her think I'd quit. I let her think the thing she'd believed in had just evaporated because I lacked the spine to see it through. She sent me one email that I still have. "I don't understand what happened to you," it said. "I believed in this." I never answered it. That silence cost me a recommendation, a champion, and a friend, and I paid it out of pure pride. I graduated that August, late and diminished, with a thesis I'd cobbled back together from cloud files into something that passed but didn't sing. Nobody at the ceremony knew the difference. I knew. Then I tried to get back into design, and I learned the second lesson, which is that a burned portfolio doesn't just cost you one night, it costs you every door that night was the key to. I sat in interviews at design firms with a thin folder and watched hiring managers wait for the part that wasn't there. "Your ideas are strong," one of them told me, not unkindly. "We just need to see finished work, a body of work. Do you have anything more built out?" I had 4 years of finished work. It was in a jam jar on my shelf. I said I was still rebuilding my portfolio, and I watched him write me off in real time, politely. There was a stretch that winter where I thought about quitting architecture entirely. I looked at job listings for other things: office manager, paralegal, medical billing, anything with a steady paycheck and no easels. I got as far as one interview for an administrative job at an insurance company, and it went well, and on the drive home I pulled over on the shoulder of the highway and sat there with my hands on the wheel for 20 minutes, because taking it would have meant agreeing with my father. It would have meant he was right, that a woman like me lands eventually in an office, being useful, and the drawings were always just a phase I had to be shaken out of. There was a night around then, the low point, when Brooke called me to babysit last minute, and I said no for the first time in my life, and she was so shocked she didn't even get angry. She just said, "Oh," and hung up, and then my mother called 10 minutes later to ask what had gotten into me. And I sat in my half-empty apartment with the jam jar of ash on the counter and understood that they had a version of me they were going to keep no matter what I did. The reliable one. The one without a real life. The one whose time belonged to the family. And that as long as I stayed in reach of them, I would keep being cast in it. So I took my drawings down off the walls of my apartment, the one I finally started actually living in, and I put the jam jar on a high shelf where I wouldn't have to look at it. I stopped talking about architecture with my family, and without quite deciding to, I stopped asking them to see me. That last part turned out to matter. For 31 years, I'd been auditioning for people who had already decided not to watch. The day I stopped auditioning was the first quiet thing that ever helped, because I wasn't done with architecture. I just had to find a door my family didn't know how to guard. I found it almost by accident, and I found it because of a man who read me correctly on the first try. His name is Roland Ashby. That spring, out of options, I applied for a coordinator job at a firm called Halstead Advisory Group. Halstead isn't a design firm. It's an owner's representative. The company a city or a developer hires to manage a big construction project on their behalf, to run the selection process, to review the proposals that architects submit, to protect the owner's interests. It is, in a sense, the other side of the table from the one I'd trained for. The side that judges the drawings instead of making them. Roland was a principal there, a man in his mid-50s with reading glasses he was always pushing up his nose. My interview didn't go the way the others had. He didn't ask to see my portfolio. He slid a set of drawings across the table, a mechanical section for some project, and said, "There are 3 problems in here. Take your time." I found them in about 4 minutes. A duct running through a beam, a door swing into a code-required clearance, a stair that didn't actually make its floor to floor. I circled them and slid the page back. He looked at it, then at me, and pushed his glasses up. "I don't need someone who can draw the building," he said. "I've got 100 of those. I need someone who can tell when a drawing is lying to me." For the first time in over a year, somebody wanted the exact thing my family had tried to burn out of me. Not my compliance, my eye. I took the job. And here I have to be honest about the shape of the next stretch, because it wasn't a montage of triumph. It was slow. I started as a coordinator, which is a polite word for the person who keeps track of everything and gets credit for none of it. I was good at it, because I'd spent my whole life being the reliable one, and for once that was an asset instead of a cage. I got better. I learned to read a submission the way a mechanic listens to an engine, waiting for the note that's wrong. I caught things other people signed off on. Once I flagged a structural inconsistency buried in a bid, a column that quietly didn't line up floor to floor, the kind of thing that turns into a change order worth hundreds of thousands of dollars once the concrete's poured, and a senior colleague asked me how on earth I'd seen it. "I used to be the person making it," I said. I didn't explain more than that. He didn't need to know that I'd once designed a building good enough to be a national finalist. He just needed to know I could read. The first time Roland put my name on a memo to a client, over a catch that saved them real money, I stared at it for a second longer than was normal. My name, on a document, credited for the thing I'd actually done. It's a small thing. In my family, it would have been unimaginable. My father had a rule, unspoken but ironclad. Credit flowed toward Brooke, and responsibility flowed toward me. Roland ran the opposite rule without ever announcing it. When I was right, he said so, out loud, in front of people. It rewired something in me slowly, the way physical therapy rewires a joint. I stopped flinching when I was about to be noticed. There was a setback, because there's always a setback, and the real ones don't get resolved by the next scene. A project I'd poured a year into, a rec center on the east side, a good building for a neighborhood that needed one, got killed when the funding fell through. No drama, no villain, just a line item that lost a vote in a budget meeting I wasn't in. I'd broken my own rule and let myself care about it, and it evaporated in an afternoon, and for a week I was right back in the old feeling, the one where the thing you build gets taken by a decision made somewhere you're not allowed to stand. Roland found me at my desk after hours, staring at the dead file. He didn't do comfort. He did something better. "You want to know the difference between this job and the one you trained for?" he said. "In design, you fall in love. In this job, you keep the receipts. The buildings you love will get killed by people in rooms you'll never see. But if you keep the record clean, if you're the one who's right on paper, the record outlasts the room. Loud fades. Paper stays." He tapped my monitor once and left. I didn't fully understand it that night. I would understand it completely about a year later, in a glass conference room, with my finger not quite on a button. "In this work," he said, "you don't win by being the loudest person in the room. You win by being the one who's right on paper. Loud fades. Paper stays." By early 2026, I'd been at Halstead a little over a year. I was steady. I had my own small apartment I actually slept in, a savings account, and a job where people trusted my eye. I'd rebuilt myself into someone quiet and competent, and I thought, finished with the past. My family and I spoke a few times a year, on holidays, carefully. My father had no idea what I did for a living. He'd never asked. As far as he knew, I'd come to my senses and taken some office job, which was, in his telling, exactly what he'd always said would happen. Somewhere in that year, a new firm popped up in the market reports I skimmed. A small design studio called Larkspur. I noted the name the way you note a stranger's face in a crowd, and I moved on. Then, in February, Roland put me on the intake for a new project. Riverside Public Library and Civic Commons, he said, dropping a stack of proposal binders on my desk. 22 million. The city's redevelopment authority is the owner. We're managing selection. Screen the submissions, flag anything that doesn't add up, and route the strong ones up. You've got a good nose for this. Quick pause, because if you've ever watched something you built get handed to someone who didn't build it, if you've ever been the reliable one while someone else got the credit, I want to hear from you. Comment below. Would you have spoken up, or would you have stayed the bigger person? Hold that thought. Now let me tell you what was in that stack. I almost didn't get to Larkspur's binder that first afternoon. It was near the bottom. When I finally opened it, I stopped breathing before I'd read a single word. I knew the building before I knew the name. The folded timber roof, opening west. The off-center mast carrying a reading room out over the entrance. The proportions I'd argued about with myself for months in a studio at 2 in the morning. It was on the cover, rendered in warm afternoon light, and it was mine. Not similar to mine. Not inspired by mine. Mine, down to the sweep of the cantilever. I sat very still. The office went on around me, phones and printers, and I read the name on the cover 3 times before it went in. Larkspur Studio, original design and concept. And below that, in the firm bio, founded by visionary designer Brooke Whitfield, my sister. I want to be precise about what I felt, because it wasn't a scream. It was the opposite of a scream. It was the feeling of the floor being very solid and very far away at the same time. My sister, who dropped out of design school when Caleb was born, who had never in her life drawn a stair section, who couldn't have told you the difference between a beam and a joist. My sister was submitting my thesis to win a $22 million public contract, and she was doing it 18 inches from my own hands, because the universe has a sense of humor that isn't funny. I closed the binder. I did not tell anyone yet. Not because I was scheming, because I've learned that being right isn't the same as being able to prove it, and I needed proof before I needed to be believed. The reliable one knows better than to accuse without a receipt. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, and I pulled up everything I could find about Larkspur Studio, the way you pick at a wound because leaving it alone is worse. It was maybe 18 months old, founded, I'd learn, in the fall after I graduated, right around the time I was pulling my drawings off the wall and giving up. The website was slick, all soft photography and negative space and words like human-centered and quiet luxury and designing for the people no one designs for. That last phrase stopped me cold, because it was mine. It was almost verbatim the thing I'd written on the first board of my thesis. They hadn't just taken the building, they'd taken the sentence the building was born from. There was a page about Brooke, creative director and founder, photographed leaning over a model, my model, or a careful rebuild of it, with her chin in her hand, looking visionary in a way I had never once seen my sister look in real life. There was one line, tucked at the bottom of the team page, that mattered more than all the rest. Architect of record, Dennis Pruitt, AIA. A licensed architect. Someone had to hold the stamp, because Brooke couldn't. Someone licensed had signed off on drawings of a building my sister could not have designed. The studio had done a handful of small things before this. A dentist's office, a cafe build-out, nothing that looked remotely like the Riverside proposal. And then, out of nowhere, a full civic library, with a structural concept that would challenge a firm 3 times its size. Here's the detail that turned the floor to water. The proposal didn't just have my design, it had the physical version. The refinements I'd made by hand in the last weeks, on the boards, in the model, the ones that never made it into my cloud files. They were in the render. The west-facing fold at the exact revised angle. The mast in its final position, not the earlier one. The threshold detail I'd only ever finished in foam. The cloud version was rougher. This was the paper version. And the paper version no longer existed. It couldn't. I had watched it burn. Someone had a copy of what my father set on fire. I needed to know who and how. The next morning, I did the hardest professional thing I've ever done. I walked into Roland's office, closed the door, and recused myself from my own vindication. The lead firm on Riverside is my sister's studio, I said, and the design they submitted is mine. My thesis, the one I told you got destroyed before I came here. Roland took his glasses off. He's not a man who reacts fast. He waited. If I touch the decision, it looks like a grudge, I said. A junior reviewer knifing a competitor who happens to be her sister. So I won't touch the decision. I'll sign whatever recusal you want. But you need to see this, and you need to see it like I'm a stranger handing you a problem, not like it's my problem. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Show me like you're a stranger." That mattered more than I can tell you. He didn't take my word. A weaker man would have either dismissed me or believed me too fast. Roland did neither. He took my files. I gave him the receipts I had. The dated competition submission from 2023, my name, a timestamp on a third-party server, years before Larkspur existed. The cloud revision history, showing the design growing over years under my account. And the old review emails from Professor Hart, dated, discussing the exact building, the wren, the concept, under my name, long before my sister ever claimed a pencil. Roland went through it the way he goes through everything, slowly, checking dates against dates, saying almost nothing. He pulled up the competition portal himself, rather than take my screenshot for it. A third-party server, my name, a submission logged in 2023, a full year and a half before Larkspur Studio existed on any document anywhere. He opened 3 of Hart's emails and read the dates, then read the content, then read the dates again. He is not a man who gets excited, and I watched him not get excited in a way that told me more than excitement would have. "This is authorship," he said finally. "Independent, dated, third party. A student competition doesn't care about your family, and neither does a professor's timestamp. This alone is enough to make the authorities stop and take a hard look." He set the pages down and lined their edges up square, a habit of his. Then he frowned at the render on his screen, and back at my cloud files, and he found the same thing I had, the thing that had kept me up. "But here's the problem, and you already know it. Your own proof stops one version short of theirs. Your files are rougher than their submission. The building in their proposal is more finished than anything under your name. If I were defending them, that's exactly where I'd attack. I'd say the finished design is theirs, and yours is just an early student sketch they improved on. So." He looked at me. "Where did the finished version come from?" "I don't know," I said. "The finished version only ever existed on the boards, and the boards are ash." I was quiet again. Roland's quiet is a working quiet. "A proposal isn't just a picture," he said. "It's a stack of files. Renderings get built from source images, and files remember things people forget." He turned his monitor toward me and opened Larkspur's own submission package, the high-resolution source files they'd been required to provide. "Let's look at the properties, not the drawing, the file." We opened the first source image behind the hero render, and the dates started to speak. I'm not going to pretend I understood every technical thing on that screen, and I won't pretend to you either, because the truth is simpler and worse than any expertise. Every digital photo, every scan, carries a little notebook inside it. Notes the file keeps about itself, when it was made, sometimes where, sometimes by whom. Most people never look, because most people have no reason to. The images underneath Larkspur's beautiful render weren't renders at all, not originally. They were scans, high-resolution scans of physical boards, cleaned up and painted over, but scans underneath. And the little notebook inside each one said the same thing: created. And then a date. I knew the date before Roland read it aloud, because there is only one date it could have been. It was the night before my fellowship review, the night of the fire, late, a timestamp near midnight. Someone had photographed my boards, in high resolution, methodically, hours before they went into the barrel. I sat back. The office sounds went far away again. "Let me help you back it up," I said out loud, not to Roland. He said that, in the garage, a few days before. He said he wanted to help me protect my work. "Who did?" Roland asked, gently. "My father." Roland didn't say anything. He just went to the next file. Because it wasn't only dates in the little notebook. Some of the source files carried a path, the digital address of where they'd lived when they were made, the folder, the account. And there it was, embedded in my sister's $22 million proposal, plain as a name on a mailbox, a user folder. G. Whitfield. Scans. My father's name, inside my sister's lie. I want to tell you what that did, because it wasn't a fresh wound. It was an old wound turning out to be deeper than I'd measured. For 2 years I'd carried the story that my father, in a fit of contempt, had burned my work to teach me a lesson. Cruel, but hot. Human. A bad night. That's not what happened. He didn't burn my work in anger. He copied it first, carefully, under the cover of kindness, and then he burned the originals so that no competing physical proof would ever exist. The fire wasn't the crime. The fire was covering the crime. The man who spent my whole life calling my work a hobby had cared enough to preserve every page of it, not to protect it, to steal it. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I did the next thing, because I've learned you keep pulling the thread even when your hands are shaking. Roland, to his credit, didn't let me spiral. He kept us on the method. We don't accuse, we document. One thing at a time. He had me confirm the pattern across more than one image, so it wasn't a fluke of a single corrupted file. The same creation date, that night, near midnight, showed up again and again beneath the render. Consistent, deliberate, a photo session, not an accident. If my father made the scans, who built a whole company around them? A studio costs money, real money, software licenses, a lease, a licensed architect on retainer to hold the stamp. Brooke had 2 kids and a part-time job and no money. So I looked at what a person can look at. The public business filings, the ones anybody with a library card and an afternoon can pull. Larkspur Studios' formation documents listed its initial capital contribution, right there in a searchable state database. The name on it wasn't Brooke's. It was my mother's, Diane Whitfield. There it was, in a state database, in plain type. My mother had funded the studio. The family helping Brooke get on her feet. The thing they'd all congratulated themselves about at Thanksgiving was my parents building a company on a foundation of my burned work and installing my sister as the face of it. My father supplied the stolen design. My mother supplied the money. My sister supplied the smile. I thought about Dennis Pruitt, the architect of record, the licensed name that made the whole thing legal on paper. Someone had stamped these drawings. I didn't know yet whether he knew where the design came from, and I made a note not to assume he did. Not everyone in a rotten structure is rotten. Some people just don't look up. I sat with the whole shape of it for a long time that night, because it changed the thing I thought I knew about my own father. For 2 years the story in my head had been that he'd lost his temper, that he was old-fashioned and controlling, and that one night it boiled over and he did something terrible and hot. I could almost forgive a hot thing. Hot things are human. This was cold. He'd stood in that garage under good lighting and asked me which pages were the important ones. He'd photographed the parts of the design that only existed on paper, the exact refinements that made it fundable. And then he'd burned the originals so that no version could ever compete with the copy he was keeping. That's not a temper, that's a plan. A man doesn't accidentally document a thing in high resolution and then accidentally destroy it hours later. He'd decided my work was a resource the family could use, decided I was the daughter who could be spent, and executed it with the same steady patience he used on his neighbor's fences. The tenderness in the garage hadn't been a rare moment of him seeing me. It had been the most calculated thing he ever did. And then there was the last thing, the thing that turned my stomach, even though it should have been the least of it. As I traced how Larkspur had climbed from cafe build-outs to a civic finalist so impossibly fast, I found the shape of my father's hand again. Not a document. I want to be careful here, because this part I inferred rather than proved on paper, and I've promised myself to be honest about the difference. But my father spent 30 years in the local trades, and he knew everyone, and he was owed 100 small favors. And Larkspur had gotten a warm, early word into the selection process from someone in a position to give one. He didn't just give my sister my building. He greased the road under it so that even her win wasn't really hers, which meant the sentence he'd send me, she actually did something with her life, was going to be a lie inside a lie inside a lie. She hadn't done it. He had. To me. Using my own hands' work, twice. She actually did something with her life, he would tell me later, about all this. And the worst part is that even that was a lie. She hadn't done anything. He'd done it. To me, twice. There was one folder in the scan set I hadn't opened yet. It was buried in the source package, unused in the final render, the kind of thing you only find if you keep going after you have enough. It had a label, and the label was in my handwriting. I opened it. It was my sketchbook, all of it. Every page my father had photographed in the garage that night, under the good lights, while I thanked him. I scrolled slowly. There were my grandmother's notes in the margins, her handwriting, the one that had been ash for 2 years. There was her little drawing of a bird. There was the ghost of the pressed flower, flattened against a page. The fire had taken the last physical thing that carried my grandmother's handwriting, and my father's theft, his careful, greedy theft, was the only reason any image of it still existed in the world. I sat in my apartment at midnight, looking at my grandmother's handwriting on a screen, preserved by the man who'd burned the paper it was written on, and I didn't know what to do with a mercy that cruel. On the last page, there was a line I'd written the week before the review, when I was still whole, still hopeful, still someone's granddaughter finishing the thing she'd started for her. It said, "For the woman who taught me to build for the people no one builds for." And there, beside it, in my own hand, the small drawing of a wren, the one I hid in every threshold, the one that was, at that moment, sitting in the entry floor of my sister's rendering, being called original. My grandmother used to say, "Notice the small things, little wren. They're what hold the rest up." Brooke had reproduced that wren so faithfully she'd copied it into her render, and she'd have no idea what it was. To her, it was decoration. A happy accident. To me, it was the whole reason the building existed. Over the next few days, Roland and I built the packet the way you'd build a wall, one course at a time, each piece carrying the one above it. The competition entry proved authorship. The cloud history proved the design grew under my account over years. Hart's emails proved a third party had discussed this exact building with me long before Larkspur existed. The metadata proved the scans were made the night of the fire. The embedded path proved whose account made them. The business filing proved who paid. And the wren, side by side, my dated original and their render, proved that whoever built their submission had copied a detail they didn't understand from a source they had no right to. No single document did everything. Together they left no room to stand. I want to say something about how that felt, because it wasn't what I expected. I thought it would feel like loading a weapon. It didn't. It felt like being believed for the first time, not by a person, by the record itself. Every file agreed with me. For 2 years my family had rewritten my history to my face, and here was a stack of dates that couldn't be talked out of what it knew. I closed the laptop. I had what I needed for authorship. I had access, I had timing, I had knowledge, and money, and a lie built out in public over 18 months. I had, for the first time, a case that didn't depend on anyone believing poor, overlooked Karen. And I found that before I did anything with it, I wanted to give them one clean chance to tell the truth. Not for their sake, for mine. So that whatever happened next, I would know I'd offered them a door and watched them choose the wall. The next Sunday I went to dinner at my parents' house. I want to be clear about the choreography here, because it matters. I did not tell them I worked for the firm managing the Riverside selection. I did not tell them there was an investigation, because there wasn't one yet. There was me and Roland and a folder. I said nothing about my job at all. As far as that table knew, I was the office drone daughter who'd finally given up on drawings, coming home for pot roast. The whole point was to see what they'd do when they thought no one who mattered was watching. The kids were there, which I'd half hoped and half dreaded. Caleb was 7 now and reading chapter books. Lily was 4 and shy of me, because I'd stopped coming around as much, and 4-year-olds keep score in their own way. Caleb showed me a drawing he'd made of a rocket, and I told him the fins were smart because they'd keep it from wobbling, and he lit up like I'd handed him something, and for a second, the whole reason any of this was worth it sat right there at the kids' end of the table. I want to be clear. Nothing I did that night or after was aimed at them. They were the only innocent people in that house. Brooke was glowing. Larkspur had made the shortlist for Riverside, and the family already had the champagne out, metaphorically. My mother had printed one of the renderings and framed it. It sat propped on the sideboard like a grandchild's report card, my building in a drugstore frame, and every time I looked at it, my own handwriting looked back at me from the little brass bird in the floor. "It's really something, isn't it?" my mother said, catching me looking at it. "It really is," I said. And I meant it, in a way she'd never understand. I let the dinner breathe. I asked Brooke about the kids, about the studio, easy things. And then, in the tone of a curious sister, I asked her to walk me through the design. "I don't really know the technical stuff," I said, playing small, playing the way they liked me. "But I've always wondered how you come up with something like that. The roof, the way it opens up, where'd that come from?" "Oh," Brooke said, and she waved her fork a little. "It just kind of came to me. That's how it works when you have the eye for it. You wouldn't really get it. It's a designer thing." "Why does it open to the west, though?" I asked. It's the kind of question only the actual designer can answer, because the answer is a decision, not a vibe. "That's a specific choice." She hesitated. Just a flicker. "It's about the light," she said, recovering. "Making it feel warm." Which is the answer you'd give if you'd read a caption, not made a building. I nodded like she'd said something wise. "And there's this little bird in the floor of the entrance," I said. "I saw it in the picture. A little brass bird. That's a beautiful detail. What does it mean?" Brooke laughed. "Isn't that funny? That was almost a happy accident. It just felt right." She reached over and squeezed my hand, and for 1 second I saw that she believed it. She'd told herself this story so many times that some part of her had moved in. "You've got such an eye for the sweet little things, Car. You always notice the small stuff." Our grandmother called me Little Wren. Brooke had a brass wren in her floor and no idea why it was there, and she'd just told me, without knowing it, that noticing small things was my gift, not hers. That was the first door, and she'd walked past it. I gave my father the second one. Over dessert, lightly, I said, "Hey, Dad, random question. That night, years ago, you helped me photograph my old boards in the garage. Do you still have those pictures anywhere? I've been trying to rebuild my portfolio and I've got almost nothing from back then." I watched him. He didn't blink. "Those old boards?" He gave a short laugh and shook his head. "Karen, that's ancient history. I don't have anything like that. I told you back then, and I'll tell you now. Some women build real lives, and some women just play architect. You finally got yourself a real job. Don't go digging around in a hobby you gave up. It's not healthy." He said it looking right at me, with total confidence. Because as far as he knew, the only copies of my work in the world were his, safely hidden, and the originals were ash. He denied ever making the scans that his own name was, at that moment, embedded inside, in a proposal that would land on a public board. "Let's not ruin dinner," my mother said, reaching for the coffee, doing what she always did, smoothing the tablecloth over the thing underneath. I said, "You're right, I'm sorry I brought it up." And I let them think they'd won the evening, because that was the confirmation I'd been waiting for. Not their guilt. I already had that, in dated files and public records. Their choice. Offered a clean, easy chance to say a true thing at their own table. Both of them had looked me in the eye and lied. Whatever came next, they'd chosen it in that room, over pot roast, with the framed rendering of my stolen building watching from the sideboard. The provisional selection was announced a few days later, on a Tuesday morning. The city's redevelopment authority named Larkspur Studio as the selected firm for the Riverside Public Library and Civic Commons. It went out in a press release and a couple of local business articles. "Boutique Studio wins Landmark Civic Commission." My sister's face and my building. I was at the Halstead office when it broke, sitting in a glass conference room with Roland. This is the part I need you to understand about timing, because it's the part that makes it fair instead of ugly. A provisional selection isn't a signed contract. It's a recommendation. Before the city executes a $22 million agreement, the owner's board has to approve it. And there's a review window. The exact window where an owner's representative is supposed to raise any question about the integrity of a submission. That window is why I'd waited. Not to ambush anyone. To act at the one gate where acting was clean. The packet was ready. Roland and I had assembled it carefully over those 2 weeks. The dated competition entry, the cloud revision history, Professor Hart's dated review emails, the file metadata showing the scans were created the night of the fire, the embedded path with my father's name, and a simple side-by-side of the brass wren in my dated originals and in Larkspur's render. Every claim independent, every date checkable, no lawsuit, no accusation I couldn't back with a document. It sat in a drafted email, addressed to the selection committee and the authorities board, in a folder marked to send. It reaches the board before they execute, Roland had said. That's the honest way to do this. When you're sure, you tell me, and I send it, not before. We were in the glass room going over it one more time. Roland reading the cover note aloud. Me checking each attachment was really attached. Both of us being careful the way you're careful with something you only get to do once. When my phone buzzed on the table. I almost didn't look. Then I did. It was a text from my father. He'd sent it the same afternoon as the announcement, because that's what he did whenever the world proved him right. He made sure I knew. He'd done it my whole life. Every time Brooke got a thing I'd wanted, there'd be a little message, a little reminder of the family math. This was just the biggest one. See, she actually did something with her life. I read it twice. I thought about the barrel, and the dish towel, and my grandmother's handwriting curling in the fire. I thought about a 9 a.m. room and an empty easel. I thought about 2 years I spent believing I hadn't been good enough, when the truth was I'd been good enough all along and my own father had known it well enough to steal it. I smiled. Then I turned to the man sitting beside me. You can send it now. Roland looked at me for a second. He wanted to be sure. That's who he is. You're certain. I've been sure for 4 years, I said. Now I can prove it. He turned back to the screen, moved the cursor, and clicked. A little bar crossed the top of the window. Sending. Then, sent. Just like that. 2 years, 4 attachments, 1 click, and it was gone out into a system full of people whose whole job was to care about exactly the kind of truth my family had spent my life telling me didn't matter. My phone was still in my hand. My father's text was still on the screen. See? She actually did something with her life. I didn't reply to it. I never did. There was nothing to say that would fit in a text, and anyway, I'd already answered him. He just didn't know it yet. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that, because the movies lie about this moment. I didn't laugh. I didn't feel powerful. I felt the way you feel when you finally set down something you've carried so long your arms have stopped knowing they hurt. Quiet, a little hollow, very tired. I looked out through the glass wall of the conference room at people at their desks doing ordinary work, and I thought about how the biggest thing that had ever happened to me had just happened in total silence, with no witnesses, over a pot of burned office coffee. Roland closed the laptop. Okay, he said softly. Now it's out of our hands and into theirs. That's how it should be. He'd sent it a little after 4 on a Tuesday. By the end of that week, my sister's studio didn't exist the way it had that morning. The authority didn't move fast, and I was glad of it, because fast would have looked like a mob. It moved like an institution, which is slow and cold, and in this one case, exactly right. Within 2 days, the board issued a short notice. The provisional award to Larkspur Studio was suspended pending an integrity review. No drama. 6 lines of bureaucratic language. It landed on the profession like a stone in a pond, because everyone in a mid-sized city's design world reads those notices, and everyone knows what integrity review means. They brought in an independent party to compare the submitted design against my dated originals. It wasn't hard. That's the thing about a good case built out of real records. It doesn't need a dramatic reveal. It just needs someone neutral to lay the dates in a row. My competition entry predated Larkspur's existence by years. The Wren matched, down to the placement. The cloud history matched. The metadata was what it was, and metadata doesn't get nervous under questioning. I heard later how it moved through the profession, and I want to be honest that it wasn't a movie. Nobody cheered. There was no room full of people applauding me, because I wasn't in any of those rooms. I'd recused myself, and I stayed recused. What there was, instead, was a quiet, careful reaction of the kind that world actually has. A few people who'd praised Larkspur went silent. A couple reached out to me, cautiously, having heard my name attached, asking if it was true. One older architect I'd never met sent me a 2-line email that just said he was sorry it had happened and glad the record got fixed. Mostly it was the sound of a lot of professionals quietly deciding they would never work with a studio that had done this. In a field where your reputation is the only thing you actually own, that silence is louder than any verdict. And Dennis Pruitt, the architect of record, the licensed name holding the whole thing up, did the thing I'd hoped a person with a stamp and a conscience might do. When the review reached him, he didn't defend it. He withdrew his name, and he stated, on the record, that he had not designed the building and had been told the concept was properly licensed to the studio. He'd looked away, and now he was looking up, and that was enough. The authorities' final letter used the phrase that ends careers in that world more thoroughly than any lawsuit could. Material misrepresentation of authorship. Larkspur Studio was disqualified from the Riverside selection. The commission was reopened. And in a professional community where reputation is the only real currency, a studio that submitted stolen work under a false claim of authorship doesn't get to quietly rebrand. It ends. There was no courtroom. I never sued anyone. I didn't have to. I'd learned the thing Roland taught me on a dead project a year before. You don't win by being loud. You win by being right on paper. The paper won. My phone started ringing that Thursday, and it did not stop. My mother first, then my father, then Brooke, over and over. I didn't answer, not out of strategy, just because I had nothing to say that would land. When I finally picked up, it was my mother, and she was crying, and the first words out of her mouth were not about the fire, or the theft, or the 2 years. "You worked there this whole time?" she said. "You knew, and you said nothing, and you let this happen?" There it was. To her, the crime wasn't what they'd done. The crime was that I'd finally been in a position to do something about it. "You never asked where I landed," I said. "You were all too busy telling everyone I hadn't landed anywhere. You've torn this family apart, Karen." She was really crying now. "Think about the children. Think about Caleb and Lily. What is Brooke supposed to do now? You have to fix this. Call them. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Be the bigger person, like you always—" "I didn't burn anything," I said. And I was surprised by how calm I was. "I didn't take anything from anyone. I just stopped putting out the fire for you. That's all this is. I stopped carrying water for people who set the fire." My father got on the phone at some point and did what he does, which is to reframe himself as the injured party. I'd humiliated the family. I'd chosen a job over my own sister. I'd always been jealous, always been difficult. He never once said the word sorry, because in his version there was nothing to be sorry for. He genuinely believed that a family's work belongs to the family, that a daughter who could be spared should be spent, that he had been managing a resource. The scariest people aren't the ones who know they're wrong. They're the ones who are certain they're right. Brooke's texts were the hardest, because underneath the anger there was fear, and underneath the fear there was a person who had let herself be handed a life she'd never questioned. "How could you do this to me?" she wrote. "To my kids. Not I'm sorry. Not you didn't deserve what happened to you. Just the assumption, bone deep, drilled into all of us since childhood, that my building was hers to lose, and my silence was hers to keep." She called once, late, and this time I answered, because I thought maybe there was a version of my sister in there who could say the true thing. There almost was. She was quiet for a while, and then she said, "Did Dad really burn it? Your stuff? Did that really happen?" And for 1 second I thought we might finally be standing in the same reality. But before I could even answer, she filled the silence herself. "It doesn't matter," she said fast, like she was talking herself back onto solid ground. "It was years ago. You gave it up. You walked away from all of it. What was anybody supposed to do? Just let it sit there?" And there it was again. The story where my work became abandoned property, the moment I stopped being allowed to fight for it. I told her I hoped she'd be okay, and that I meant it about the kids, and I hung up, because you can't argue someone out of a reality that's keeping them warm. I turned the ringer off and set the phone face down on the counter. That was the boundary, not a speech, just a small, quiet action. A phone turned over, a woman declining, at last, to manage the feelings of the people who'd spent her. It got tested, of course. Boundaries always do. Around the holidays, my mother left a long voicemail, gentler this time. The anger swapped for grief, asking if I was really going to let one mistake cost me my whole family, reminding me that the kids missed their aunt, that Vivian, she actually used my grandmother's name, which took something, would have wanted us together. I listened to the whole thing. Then I texted back one line. I love the kids and they're always welcome to know me. I'm not coming back to being the one who fixes what the rest of you break. I didn't slam a door. I didn't cut anyone off in a blaze. I just stopped being available for the old job. That's what a real boundary is, I've learned. It isn't a wall you build in anger. It's a role you quietly stop auditioning for. I didn't feel victorious. I need to keep saying that, because I think the honest version is more useful than the satisfying one. What I felt, sitting in my kitchen with the phone buzzing against the counter like a trapped fly, was grief. Because here is what the paper couldn't do. It couldn't give me back the fellowship, or the firm placement, or the version of my career that would have grown from that 9 a.m. room. It couldn't return the 2 years I'd spent smaller than I was, half believing my family's math about me. It couldn't unburn my grandmother's handwriting. Justice, it turns out, is not the same as repair. I got the building back. I did not get the 2 years back. Both of those things are true, and I've had to learn to hold them at the same time. That night, I took the jam jar down off the high shelf for the first time in 2 years. The ash had settled into a fine gray line at the bottom. I sat with it at my kitchen table, and I let myself cry the way I hadn't let myself cry in the backyard, because in the backyard, crying would have been a gift to him, and now it was only mine. For years I'd asked a question I never said out loud. Not was it fair, the deeper one. Was I ever good enough? Maybe they'd been right about me. Maybe the building was never as good as I thought. Maybe I'd have missed that fellowship anyway. Maybe I was a woman who played architect. I finally had an answer, and it didn't come from them. Two things arrived in the weeks after, and they're the ones that actually healed me, more than any board letter. The first was Professor Hart. When the story moved through the local design world, and it did, quietly, the way these things do, she heard my name attached to it, and she found me. We met for coffee. I told her the whole thing, start to finish, the part I'd been too ashamed to tell her 2 years earlier, the garage, the barrel, the silence. She was quiet for a long time, turning her coffee cup a quarter turn at a time the way people do when they're rearranging 2 years of a story in their head. Then she said, "You didn't disappear on me. You were erased. There's a difference, and it matters, and I'm sorry I ever thought it was the first one." She told me she'd been angry at me for 2 years, genuinely hurt, the way you're only hurt by students you believed in, and that the anger had been sitting on top of grief the whole time, because she'd thought the most honest young designer she'd taught in a decade had simply quit on herself. "I told other students about your library," she said, "for years, as the example of what honesty in a building looks like, and the whole time I thought you'd thrown it away." She'd kept our old correspondence, every dated email about the thesis, and she offered them to the review before I ever asked. And she said something I'll keep for the rest of my life. "That building always read as yours, not because of any signature, because it was honest, and honest is the one thing you can't fake and can't steal. You can copy the drawing, but you can't copy the reason it exists. I knew it was yours the first time I saw it. I should have come looking for you sooner. That one's on me." I told her it wasn't. I told her the silence had been mine, that I'd been too ashamed to call. And she reached across the little table and put her hand flat on top of mine, the way my grandmother used to, and she said, "Then let's both stop carrying it." The second thing was smaller, and it undid me completely. Going back through my old files during all of this, I found an email I'd never opened. It was from the student competition, the one I'd entered in 2023, the dated submission that had become the backbone of my whole case. The email had arrived that terrible spring, in the days after the fire, when I was too deep in the wreckage to open anything. I'd never read it. It was a finalist notification. My design. My library, the one my father called a hobby, the one that went into a barrel, had been named a finalist in a national student competition. The email was dated to that same terrible spring, in the days right after the fire, when my inbox was a place I couldn't bear to look. While I was standing in a hallway with an empty easel believing my career was over, a panel of people who had never met me and had nothing to gain by being kind had looked at my work, on its own, with no last name attached, and decided it was among the best in the country. I read it 4 times. Then I put my head down on my kitchen table, and I cried in a way I hadn't since I was a child, not the sharp crying of grief, but the loose, shaking kind that comes when you finally get to set down a thing you didn't know you'd been holding with every muscle in your body. Because that was the real question. Not was it fair, not who was to blame. The question that had lived under everything for 2 years was quieter and worse. Was I ever actually good enough, or were they right about me all along? Maybe the building was never as good as I thought. Maybe I'd have missed that fellowship anyway. Maybe I really was a woman who just played architect, and the fire only saved me the embarrassment of finding out slowly. I had always been good enough. The proof had been sitting unopened in my own inbox the entire time, the answer to the only question that ever really haunted me, waiting 2 years for me to be strong enough to read it. My father never had that kind of power over the truth. He only ever had power over what I believed about it. The Riverside Library still got built. Not by me. The authority reopened the selection, and it went to an established firm, which is how it should be. I was never going to design it, and I was never trying to. But the record was corrected. My authorship of the original thesis design is a matter of documentation now, permanent, unburnable. And a few months later, at Halstead, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I asked Roland if I could start moving toward the design side of the work, not to give up the eye I'd built reviewing everyone else's drawings, but to use both halves of what I was. He looked at me over his glasses and said, "I wondered when you'd ask. You've been reading these things like a designer since the day you walked in. Go make one." He didn't make me prove I deserved it. He just opened the door, which is a thing my whole family never once did, and this near stranger did without blinking. My first real project came in that fall. It was small. Nothing like a $22 million library, just a modest neighborhood building, a single decent room where people could gather, with good light and a low budget, and a client who mostly wanted it not to leak. I designed it anyway, like it mattered, because to somebody it would. Mine, though. My name on the door of the file, on the drawings, on the record that doesn't burn. I found myself, some nights, staying late over it, the way I used to stay late in studio, and I recognized the feeling only slowly, because it had been gone so long. It was joy. Plain, unglamorous, load-bearing joy. When the construction reached the entrance, I went down to the site one gray afternoon, and I knelt at the threshold with something in my hand. A small brass wren, no bigger than a thumbnail. I set it into the floor where no client would ever notice it. For her. For me. Because my grandmother taught me to notice the small things, and because the small thing had turned out to be the thing that held the rest up, exactly like she said. I don't have that family photo on my wall anymore, the one where the frame cropped me down to half a shoulder. I have a different picture now. Me, standing in front of my own finished building, whole, all of me inside the frame. Nobody cropped it. Nobody handed it to me. I stood there and someone took the shot. My father was right about one thing, in the end, though not the way he meant it. Some women build real lives. It just turns out you don't get to hand someone else's life to your favorite child and call it theirs. A career belongs to the person who builds it, not the person it's handed to. They could burn the paper. They were never able to build the thing the paper came from, because that lived somewhere they couldn't reach. In the 4 years of learning, in the eye my grandmother taught me, in the hands that had actually made it. They burned the drawings. They couldn't burn the architect. If you've ever had your work taken and your name quietly filed off it, if anyone ever told you that you were too ambitious, too much, just playing at the thing you loved, I want you to hear the part it took me 2 years in a fire to learn. You weren't too much. You were exactly enough. And the record can always, eventually, be corrected by the person patient enough to keep the receipts. I'm Karen. I got my name back. If this story reached you, stay a while. There are more of them, about people who were erased and refused to stay gone. And the next time someone tells you to be the bigger person by making yourself smaller, remember, there's another way to be the bigger person. You can just stop putting out their fire.